The gunshot echoed across the Montana plains as Jane Winter's horse collapsed beneath her, sending her tumbling down the rocky embankment. The year was 1876, and the setting sun cast long shadows over the unforgiving landscape as she lay broken and bleeding, miles from civilization, with nothing but the distant howl of wolves to keep her company. Jane's journey west had been one of desperation. After her father's death left their Philadelphia home mired in debt, she had answered an advertisement seeking teachers for frontier settlements. The stagecoach attack had come without warning, leaving her alone, terrified, and now injured beyond her ability to stand. Night was falling fast, bringing with it a bitter cold that seeped into her bones. Jane tried to pull herself up, but pain shot through her leg like wildfire. She bit her lip to keep from screaming, tasting blood as tears streamed down her dirt-streaked face. Her long chestnut hair had come loose from its pins, falling around her shoulders as she struggled to remain conscious. "Please," she whispered to the darkening sky, "I don't want to die alone." Zeke Jameson was tracking a mountain lion that had been preying on his cattle when he heard the gunshot. His hand instinctively went to his Colt revolver as he reined in his stallion, scanning the horizon with keen blue eyes that had seen their share of trouble in 30 years of frontier life. He almost missed her. The dying light played tricks on the eyes, and the woman's brown traveling dress blended with the earth. But something, a flash of movement, perhaps, or divine providence, drew his attention to the crumpled form at the bottom of the ravine. "Hold on," he called, dismounting with the agile grace of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. He approached cautiously, aware that ambushes weren't uncommon in these parts. What he found instead was a woman, barely conscious, her face pale as death against the darkening soil. Blood soaked through her skirts, and her breathing came in shallow gasps. "Madam, can you hear me?" Zeke knelt beside her, his weathered face creased with concern. Jane's eyes fluttered open, revealing irises the color of summer sage. "My horse," she whispered. "They shot my horse." "Who shot your horse, madam?" Zeke asked, already examining her injuries with gentle hands. "Men, stagecoach. They wanted." Her voice faded as consciousness slipped away again. Zeke didn't need to hear more. Stagecoach robberies had become increasingly common, and he'd heard tales of a particularly vicious gang operating in these parts. That she had escaped with her life was miracle enough. He assessed her injuries quickly. A broken leg, for certain, and possibly internal injuries. She needed shelter, warmth, and medical attention, none of which could be provided here on this desolate stretch of land with night falling fast. With careful movements, Zeke removed his coat and wrapped it around the woman's shivering form. Then, with a tenderness that belied his rugged appearance, he lifted her into his arms. "I've got you," he said, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "My cabin's not far." Jane stirred slightly in his arms, her head lolling against his chest. Even injured and half dead, there was something about her that stirred something long dormant in Zeke's heart. Perhaps it was her courage, evident in the fact that she'd managed to drag herself away from her attackers despite her injuries. Or perhaps it was simply that in 10 years of solitary ranching, she was the first woman he'd held in his arms. Mounting his horse with the woman cradled against him was no easy feat. But Zeke had not survived this long on the frontier by shrinking from challenges. Once settled, he urged his horse forward at a pace that wouldn't jostle his injured passenger too severely. As they rode, Zeke kept one arm firmly around Jane, holding her against his chest. The scent of her hair somehow still carrying traces of lavender beneath the dust, and blood stirred memories of a gentler life back east, before the war had changed everything. The journey to his cabin took longer than usual with his precious cargo, but finally, the outline of his homestead appeared against the star-filled sky. It wasn't much, a sturdy log cabin with a small corral for his horses, a barn and a vegetable garden that had seen better days, but it was shelter. And right now, that was all that mattered. Inside, Zeke laid Jane gently on his bed, working quickly to build up the fire in the stone hearth. The cabin, though simple, was clean and well-ordered. Hunting rifles hung on pegs by the door, alongside his father's old cavalry saber. A bookshelf held more volumes than most would expect from a frontier rancher, a remnant of his former life as a university student before the war called him away. Once the fire was crackling, Zeke turned his attention back to his unexpected guest. She needed medical attention beyond what he could provide, but the nearest doctor was in Butte City, a good day's ride away. Until he could fetch help, he would have to do what he could. With gentle hands, he removed her mud-caked boots and examined her leg. The break was bad, but clean the bone hadn't pierced the skin. That was something, at least. He would need to set it, a prospect that filled him with dread. He'd set broken bones in animals and once for a ranch hand, but never for a woman as delicate as this one appeared to be. Jane regained consciousness as he was gathering splints and bandages. Her eyes flew open, wild with fear and confusion. "Where am I? Who are you?" she demanded, trying to sit up before gasping in pain and falling back. "Easy now," Zeke said, his voice deliberately gentle. "My name is Zeke Jameson, Zeke to most. You're at my ranch. I found you after your horse was shot. You're safe now." Jane's eyes darted around the cabin, taking in her surroundings with the wariness of a cornered animal. "The men who attacked the stagecoach are nowhere near here," Zeke assured her. "This is my home. You're safe, but your leg is broken, and I need to set it before it starts to heal wrong." Fear flashed across her face. "Are you a doctor?" "No, madam, just a rancher who's had his share of breaks and sprains. I'd ride for the doctor in Butte City, but it's a day's journey, and that leg can't wait that long." Jane closed her eyes briefly, steeling herself. When she opened them again, there was a resolve that impressed Zeke deeply. "My name is Jane Winters," she said. "I was traveling to Fort Benton to take a position as a schoolteacher." She paused, looking down at her injured leg. "I suppose that's no longer possible." "Let's worry about getting you healed first," Zeke said, laying out the supplies he'd gathered. "This will hurt, Miss Winters, I won't lie to you about that." "I suspected as much," Jane replied with a wan smile. "Do you have any whiskey?" Zeke raised an eyebrow, surprised by her directness, then nodded and retrieved a bottle from a cabinet. He poured a generous measure into a tin cup and handed it to her. Jane took it with slightly trembling hands. "I've never actually had spirits before," she admitted. "My father would be scandalized. Your father isn't here," Zeke pointed out gently. "And sometimes necessity trumps propriety." Jane nodded and drank the whiskey in 3 quick gulps, coughing as it burned its way down her throat. "That's horrible," she gasped. Despite the gravity of the situation, Zeke found himself smiling. "It grows on you," he said, taking the cup back. "Are you ready?" Jane nodded, her face pale but determined. "Do what you must, Mr. Jameson." Zeke positioned himself at the foot of the bed. "You might want to bite down on this," he said, offering her a folded leather belt. Jane placed it between her teeth, her eyes never leaving his. There was trust there. Zeke realized with surprise trust he hadn't earned but desperately wanted to deserve. Setting the bone was as terrible as Zeke had feared. Jane's muffled screams tore at his heart, and by the time he finished splinting and wrapping her leg, they were both drenched in sweat despite the cool evening air. Jane had passed out from the pain, for which Zeke was grateful. He gently wiped her face with a damp cloth, noting the delicate features that pain had sharpened. She was beautiful, he realized with a start, not in the showy way of saloon girls or the painted ladies in town, but with a quiet dignity that spoke of strength and character. As he worked, Zeke found himself talking to her unconscious form, something he hadn't done with another person in longer than he cared to admit. "You're going to be all right, Miss Winters," he murmured as he tucked blankets around her. "I don't know what brought you out here all alone, but you're safe now, I promise you that." The night passed slowly. Zeke sat in a chair by the bed, dozing fitfully, waking at Jane's slightest movement. She developed a fever, not unexpected after such trauma. and he spent hours bathing her face and hands with cool water, murmuring reassurances when she became delirious. By dawn, her fever had broken and she slept peacefully. Zeke moved stiffly to the fireplace to make coffee, his body protesting the night spent in the hard chair. As the aroma filled the cabin, he heard a soft sound from the bed. "That smells wonderful," Jane said, her voice weak but clear. Zeke turned, relief washing over him. "Miss Winters." "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of buffalo," she replied with a grimace. "But alive, thanks to you." Zeke poured coffee into 2 cups and brought one to her, helping her sit up enough to drink it. Their fingers brushed as he handed her the cup, and he was startled by the jolt of awareness that shot through him at the contact. "Thank you," Jane said, her eyes meeting his over the rim of the cup. "Not just for the coffee, but for saving my life." "Anyone would have done the same," Zeke said, suddenly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "No," Jane said with quiet certainty, "not anyone. I've learned that the hard way." There was a story there, Zeke thought, but he didn't press. Instead, he asked, "Are you hungry? I could make some breakfast." Jane's smile transformed her face, bringing color to her cheeks. "Starving, actually." Zeke set about preparing a simple meal of cornbread and bacon. As he worked, Jane watched him from the bed. "You live here alone?" she asked. Zeke nodded. "Just me and the livestock. No wife, family." "No wife," Zeke confirmed. "My parents died before the war, no siblings either." "The war," Jane echoed. "You fought?" Zeke's hands stilled briefly over the frying pan. "Yes, Union cavalry, not something I care to discuss much." Jane seemed to sense his discomfort. "I understand." "My father lost his arm at Antietam. He never spoke of it either." Zeke appreciated her understanding. Too many people pressed for war stories, as if the bloodshed and horror made for entertaining dinner conversation. "What about you?" he asked, changing the subject as he brought her a plate. "What brings a lady like yourself out to this wilderness to teach school?" Jane accepted the food gratefully. "Necessity, primarily. My father died 6 months ago, leaving considerable debts. Our home in Philadelphia was sold to pay the creditors. Teaching was one of the few respectable options available to me. And no husband to help shoulder the burden," Zeke asked before he could stop himself. A shadow crossed Jane's face. "There was a man once. He found a wealthier prospect when my father's finances collapsed." Zeke felt a surge of anger toward this unknown man who had abandoned Jane when she needed him most. "His loss," he said simply. Jane looked up, surprised, then offered a small smile. "Perhaps." The day passed quietly. Jane slept intermittently, her body working to heal. Zeke tended to his chores, checking on her frequently. By evening, she was awake enough to eat a more substantial meal and engage in conversation. "How long have you lived here?" she asked as Zeke stoked the fire against the chill of the Montana night. 10 years, he replied. "Came west after the war, couldn't settle back into city life." "It's beautiful country," Jane observed. "Wild but beautiful." Zeke looked at her curiously. "Most Eastern women find it too harsh." Jane's gaze turned to the window, where the last light of day painted the distant mountains purple and gold. "There's honesty in its harshness. The land doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is." Something in her words resonated deeply with Zeke. "That's it exactly," he said softly. "That's why I stayed." Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, Zeke felt understood in a way he hadn't experienced in years. The moment was broken by a sharp knock at the door. Zeke's hand moved instinctively to his revolver as he crossed to answer it. Standing on his porch was Abigail Foster, the widow who owned the neighboring ranch. Her 14-year-old son, Thomas, stood beside her. "Zeke," Abigail greeted him warmly. "We saw you didn't make it to Sunday services and thought we'd check on you." Thomas was worried. The boy flushed, embarrassed by his mother's disclosure. Zeke had helped Thomas last winter when he'd fallen through the ice on the creek, and the boy had regarded him as something of a hero ever since. "That's mighty kind of you," Zeke said. "I've got a bit of a situation here." He explained about finding Jane, keeping his voice low. Abigail's face filled with concern. "The poor dear, let me see her." I was a nurse during the war. Zeke hesitated only briefly before stepping aside to let her enter. Abigail's medical knowledge far exceeded his own, and Jane would likely appreciate another woman's presence. Thomas remained outside with Zeke while his mother examined Jane. The boy peppered him with questions about tracking and hunting that Zeke answered distractedly, his thoughts on the woman in his bed. After what seemed like an eternity, Abigail emerged from the cabin. "You did well with that leg, Zeke," she said approvingly. "Better than some army surgeons I've seen. She'll need rest, good food, and time to heal, but she should recover fully." Relief washed over Zeke. "Thank you for checking on her. She needs women's things," Abigail continued practically. "Night clothes, a hairbrush, soap that doesn't smell like a lumberjack. I'll send Thomas over tomorrow with some of my things." She fixed Zeke with a pointed look. "And I'll be checking in regularly. That young lady is in a very vulnerable position." Zeke understood the implicit warning. A single woman staying in a bachelor's home risked her reputation, even under these circumstances. "I appreciate your help, Abigail," he said sincerely. "And I give you my word as a gentleman that Miss Winters has nothing to fear from me." Abigail's expression softened. "I know that, Zeke. You're a good man. But others might talk, and that poor girl has been through enough without adding gossip to her troubles." After Abigail and Thomas departed, Zeke returned to find Jane looking better than she had since he'd found her. Some color had returned to her cheeks, and her hair had been neatly braided. "Mrs. Foster is very kind," Jane said. "She said you're well respected in the community." Zeke shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Abigail's good people. Her husband was killed by rustlers 2 years back. She's run the ranch herself since then, with just Thomas to help." "She said you've been a godsend to them," Jane persisted. "That you helped them keep their land when the bank tried to foreclose." Zeke busied himself with the coffee pot. "Neighbors help neighbors out here, that's all." Jane watched him with those perceptive green eyes. "You don't take compliments well, do you, Mr. Jameson?" "Zeke," he corrected. "And no, I suppose I don't." "Well, Zeke," Jane said, his name sounding different better somehow in her voice, "you'll have to get used to them from me." "I owe you my life." "You don't owe me anything," Zeke said firmly, "and as soon as you're well enough to travel, I'll take you wherever you want to go." A shadow crossed Jane's face. "I don't know where that would be." "I had just enough money for the stage fare to Fort Benton and a room until my first month's teaching wages, with no position and no money." She trailed off, the reality of her situation sinking in. "We'll figure something out," Zeke promised. "But first you need to heal." The days that followed fell into a gentle rhythm. Each morning, Zeke would help Jane to sit up and eat breakfast before heading out to tend his ranch. He'd return midday to check on her, then again in the evening for supper and conversation that stretched late into the night. Jane proved to be an avid reader, delighted by Zeke's surprisingly extensive library. They discovered a shared love of Dickens and debated the merits of Whitman's poetry. Jane had been educated at a women's seminary in Boston, and her knowledge of literature and history impressed Zeke, who had completed 2 years at Harvard before the war interrupted his studies. Abigail visited every few days, bringing not only the promised women's necessities but also fresh bread, jars of preserved fruit, and news from town. Thomas came more frequently, eager to help Zeke with chores that would allow him to spend more time with Jane. As promised, Abigail had sent word to Fort Benton about Jane's situation. A letter arrived a week later, expressing regret but informing Jane that they had been forced to give the teaching position to another candidate when she failed to arrive. "I'm sorry," Zeke said, seeing the disappointment on Jane's face as she read the letter. "It's not unexpected," Jane replied, folding the letter carefully. "They couldn't leave children without instruction indefinitely. What will you do now?" Zeke asked, realizing as he spoke that he dreaded her answer. The thought of Jane leaving had become increasingly troubling to him. Jane looked down at her splinted leg. "I can't do much of anything until this heals, but afterward." She sighed. "I suppose I'll need to find another position." perhaps in Butte City or Helena. The idea of Jane living in one of Montana Territory's rough mining towns, surrounded by men who would see her beauty and vulnerability as something to exploit, made Zeke's stomach churn. "You could stay here," he blurted out before he could think better of it. "Until you find something suitable," he added hastily, seeing her startled expression. "That's very generous," Jane said slowly, "but I couldn't impose on you indefinitely." "It's not an imposition," Zeke insisted. "The cabin's never felt so, lived in, and you're good company." Jane's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "You're good company too, Zeke. Better than I expected when I first woke up in a strange man's bed." The phrase hung in the air between them, innocent in intent but charged with sudden awareness. Jane blushed, and Zeke found himself fascinated by the way the color spread across her cheeks. "I should check the fence line," he said abruptly, standing. "The cattle got out last week." He fled the cabin, needing the clean mountain air to clear his head. This attraction to Jane was inappropriate given her situation. She was dependent on him for shelter and care. The last thing she needed was unwanted advances from the man who had rescued her. But as the days passed and Jane grew stronger, Zeke found it increasingly difficult to maintain his distance. She had begun to move around the cabin with the aid of crutches Zeke had fashioned, and the domestic sight of her cooking at his stove or reading in the chair by the fire stirred longings he had thought long buried. One evening, nearly 3 weeks after he had found her, Zeke returned from checking his cattle to find Jane standing at the stove, stirring a pot of stew. She had pinned up her hair, but tendrils had escaped to curl around her face, damp from the steam. She wore one of Abigail's old dresses, altered to fit her slimmer frame. "Something smells wonderful," Zeke said, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. Jane turned, her face lighting up at the sight of him. "Mrs. Foster brought venison from their hunt. I thought I'd try my hand at cooking for a change to thank you for all you've done." "You don't need to thank me," Zeke began, but Jane cut him off with a raised hand. "I want to," she said simply. "Please let me do this one small thing." Zeke nodded, recognizing her need to reciprocate in some way. "Then I accept with gratitude." The meal was delicious, the venison tender in a rich gravy with root vegetables from Zeke's garden. They ate by lamplight, the golden glow softening the cabin's rough-hewn walls. "I had a letter from my aunt today," Jane said as they finished eating. "Abigail brought it from town." Zeke looked up, surprised. He hadn't known Jane had any family remaining. "Your aunt," Jane nodded. "My father's sister. She lives in Boston with her husband. I wrote to her after my father died, but her reply came after I had already left Philadelphia." She twisted her napkin in her hands. "She's offered me a home with them." Something cold settled in Zeke's chest. "Boston, that's a long way from Montana." "Yes," Jane agreed, not meeting his eyes. "It would mean returning east, leaving all this behind." "Is that what you want?" Zeke asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Jane was silent for a long moment. "A month ago I would have said yes without hesitation. Now," she looked up, her eyes meeting his. "Now I'm not so certain." Hope flickered in Zeke's heart, dangerous and fragile. "What's changed?" "Everything," Jane said softly. "I've changed. Or perhaps I've simply discovered parts of myself that were always there, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge." "What parts are those?" Zeke asked, hardly daring to breathe. "The part that finds beauty in this wild country. The part that doesn't mind the silence or the solitude. The part that—" She hesitated, then continued with quiet courage. "The part that has grown very fond of a certain rancher who carried me into his cabin when I was broken." Zeke felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. "Jane," he began, not sure what he wanted to say but needing to say something. "I know it's forward of me," Jane continued quickly, "and perhaps unwelcome. But before I make any decisions about Boston or anywhere else, I needed to know if you might consider." She faltered, courage failing her. Zeke reached across the table and took her hand in his. "There hasn't been a day since I found you that I haven't considered it," he said, his voice low and intense. But you were injured, dependent on me. It wouldn't have been right. And now, Jane asked, her fingers tightening around his. Now I'm terrified you'll go to Boston and I'll never see you again, Zeke admitted. Jane's smile was like dawn breaking over the mountains. I'm not going to Boston, she said with sudden certainty. Where will you go? Zeke asked, hardly daring to hope for her answer. Nowhere, Jane said simply. If you'll have me, I'd like to stay right here. Zeke stood, still holding her hand, and moved around the table to kneel beside her chair. Jane Winters, I've been alone for so long that I'd forgotten what it was like to want someone's company. But from the moment I carried you into this cabin, something changed. You've brought light and laughter back into my life. Jane's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. You saved more than my life that day, Zeke. You saved my spirit. I was so lost, so afraid of what would become of me. And then there you were, like an answer to a prayer I hadn't even known I'd made. Zeke reached up to brush a tear from her cheek. I love you, Jane. I think I've loved you since that first night when you drank my terrible whiskey without complaint and trusted me to set your broken leg. Jane laughed through her tears. That whiskey was truly awful. I love you, Zeke repeated, needing her to understand the depth of his feelings. And if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never feel broken or alone again. Jane leaned forward, her hand coming up to cup his cheek. I love you too, Zeke Jameson, and yes, I'll have you for as long as you'll have me. Their first kiss was gentle, a tentative exploration that quickly deepened into something more urgent. When they finally parted, both were breathless. You should know, Zeke said, suddenly serious, that life out here isn't easy. Winters are harsh. The nearest town is a day's ride. There are no theaters or museums or fancy shops. I don't need those things, Jane assured him. I need this. She gestured around the cabin. The honesty of this place, the beauty of the land, the man who calls it home. There is something else, Zeke said, remembering his conversation with Abigail earlier that week. The settlement 10 miles east is growing. They've been asking about starting a school. They need a teacher. Jane's eyes widened. A teaching position? Here, Zeke nodded. Abigail mentioned your credentials to some of the families. They're eager to meet you once you're fully recovered. So I could teach and still come home to you each night, Jane said, her face radiant with joy. Home, Zeke repeated, liking the sound of it on her lips. Yes, this would be your home, our home. The following spring, with the wildflowers painting the Montana prairies in a riot of color, Jane and Zeke were married in a simple ceremony outside their cabin. Abigail Foster stood as Jane's witness, while Thomas proudly served as Zeke's best man. Jane wore a new dress of blue calico, ordered specially from the Mercantile in Butte City. Her leg had healed completely, though she occasionally used a cane on cold mornings when the old break ached. In her hair, she wore a crown of wildflowers gathered by the children she now taught in the one-room schoolhouse that served the growing settlement. The school had opened in January, with 15 students ranging from 6 to 16 years of age. Jane had taken to teaching on the frontier with unexpected enthusiasm, adapting her Eastern education to the practical needs of children growing up in the West. As they spoke their vows beneath the big Montana sky, Zeke marveled at how his life had changed in less than a year. The solitude he had once embraced now seemed empty compared to the joy of sharing his days and nights with Jane. I promise to carry you whenever you need carrying, he said as he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, and to love you until my last breath. And I promise to bring light into the darkest nights, Jane replied, her voice steady despite the tears shimmering in her eyes. And to love you with all that I am for all of my days. That night, as they lay together in the bed where he had first placed her broken body nearly a year before, Zeke held Jane close and whispered, I never thought I'd find this kind of happiness again. Jane pressed a kiss to his chest, right over his heart. Perhaps we needed to be a little broken first to recognize what would make us whole. Zeke's arms tightened around her. You're my home now, Jane. Wherever you are, that's where I belong. And you're mine, Jane murmured, sleep beginning to claim her. the man who carried me into his cabin and his heart. 5 years later, the Jameson Ranch had prospered beyond Zeke's wildest dreams. The cabin had been expanded to include 2 additional rooms, one for their 3-year-old daughter, Emily, and another for the baby boy who had arrived just 2 months earlier. Jane continued to teach, though now she did so from their home during the winter months when travel was difficult. In spring and summer, Zeke would drive her to the schoolhouse in the wagon, often with Emily chattering excitedly beside them. On the anniversary of the day Zeke had found Jane, they always rode together to the spot where her life had nearly ended, and where, in many ways, it had truly begun. They would lay wildflowers there in gratitude for the chance encounter that had brought them together. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't heard that gunshot?" Jane asked as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold. Zeke's arm tightened around her shoulders. "I try not to think about it, but I do believe some things are meant to be, if not that day, perhaps another." Jane leaned her head against his shoulder. "I used to think coming west was the biggest mistake of my life. Now I know it was the path I was always meant to take, broken leg and all." Zeke chuckled, pressing a kiss to her hair. "I'm grateful every day for that broken leg. It gave me time to fall in love with you before you could run away." "I wouldn't have run," Jane said, turning to face him. "Even if I could have walked, I would have chosen to stay." Inside the cabin, their infant son began to cry, and Emily's voice called out, "Mama, Papa, baby William is awake." Jane and Zeke exchanged a smile filled with contentment. They had found in each other not just love, but family, purpose, and home, all because a wounded schoolteacher had been too broken to walk, and a lonely cowboy had carried her into his cabin and his heart.